One of the biggest mistakes by the forces of darkness during the War of the Ring occurred at Weathertop. The Witch King and the Nazgul had Frodo Baggins cornered, and although they were driven off, the Witch King did manage to stab Frodo with a Morgul knife. In the Witch King's mind, this was mission accomplished, but Frodo survived and eventually ended up carrying the One Ring to Mount Doom. So why was the Witch King so confident? What does a Morgul-blade actually do, and what are the consequences for those who are wounded by one? On the night of the 6th of October, 3018, Frodo and his companions are attacked by the Nazgul upon Weathertop. Frodo attempts to use the One Ring to hide, but the Nazgul can still see him. The Witch King draws a Morgul knife, stabs Frodo in the shoulder, and then Aragorn, armed with fire, appears and drives the Nazgul away. The Witch King expects the Ring-bearer to succumb to the Morgul wound fairly quickly, as most do. But Frodo instead survives 14 days before reaching Rivendell and a further 3 days in Rivendell. And only then is the wound healed by Elrond, although not without lasting consequences. Okay, so first things first, what is Morgul? Well, Morgul just means black or dark sorcery. This is such a broad, vague term that it isn't exactly helpful by itself. It basically just means that a Morgul-blade is a weapon that has been enchanted with dark magic, and likewise, a Morgul wound is a wound that has been poisoned with dark magic. We don't know all the details, such as different types of Morgul weapons or Morgul wounds, and whether these weapons are supposed to inflict different types of outcomes on those who have been wounded. In Frodo's case, we know what the Witch King was intending. He was intending to pierce Frodo's heart with a Morgul knife, which according to Gandalf would have resulted in Frodo turning into a lesser wraith that would have been under the Witch King's command. Once becoming a lesser wraith, Frodo would have become invisible, like the Nazgul themselves, and would have willingly delivered the One Ring to them. We don't know the exact mechanics of how this works, except that it had something to do with the tip of the knife breaking off and lodging in the heart of the afflicted person. Even if the blade didn't pierce the person's heart, the piece that remained inside would gradually make its way to the heart. Interestingly, in the case of Frodo, the wound actually closed over fairly quickly, and didn't look bad from the outside, disguising what was going on within. Of course, the Witch King was unsuccessful. Frodo's last moment of resistance, yelling the name of Elbereth and striking at the Witch King himself, would lead to the Witch King's knife going astray. Instead of piercing Frodo's heart, it ended up piercing his shoulder, leaving his shoulder and arm numb and weak. According to Gandalf, even great warriors of men would have been overcome in just a few days, implying that he has experience with this kind of thing. But Frodo and hobbits in general are made of sterner stuff, thus Frodo's body managed to fight the Morgul wound long enough to receive treatment in Rivendell over 2 weeks later. If you're actually interested in how badly the Witch King blundered at Weathertop, I did a whole video on it a long time ago, which I'll leave at the end of the video. To summarize it, after Frodo yelling out Elbereth, the appearance of the Barrow-blade, and of Aragorn, the Witch King felt like he was in grave danger, hence why they didn't hang around to just finish the job. He thought Frodo would be too injured to move and would succumb to the wound within a few days. But instead, Frodo was able to get moving pretty much straight away, so the Nazgul basically lost them by the very next day, and by the time they found Frodo again, it was too late. In terms of treating a Morgul wound, it doesn't seem to have been very easy at all. Both Aragorn and Glorfindel quickly admit that Frodo's wound is beyond either of them, although both of them are able to provide him some comfort. Gandalf actually told Frodo that by the time he arrived unconscious in Rivendell, he didn't believe that there was much of a chance in saving him. It took the expert skills of Elrond, and even then, it took Elrond 3 whole days to find and remove the splinter of the Morgul knife. Gandalf believed that if it had taken a few more hours, Frodo would have finally succumbed to the wound. There's only really 2 other instances of Morgul wounds in the lore, or rather, one actual instance and one instance that was believed to be a Morgul wound, but thankfully wasn't. That was in regards to Faramir, who was gravely wounded during the retreat to Minas Tirith. Eventually, Aragorn diagnoses him as having almost succumbed to the Black Breath, but earlier points out that if Faramir had been shot by one of the Nazgul, as it was initially feared, then he would have died that same night. We're not sure if all of the Nazgul's weapons were Morgul weapons, or whether Aragorn is just referring to some other type of potent poison that the Nazgul might have used. After all, poisoned weapons were commonly used by creatures of darkness such as orcs. The other actual instance of a Morgul wound was in regards to Boromir, Steward of Gondor, not the one from the Fellowship of the Ring. Boromir, the son of Steward Denethor I, was described as noble, strong, and a great captain of men that even the Witch King feared. In 2475 of the Third Age, Mordor launched a surprise attack on Gondor, resulting in the final ruin of Osgiliath. But Boromir held the line and led a series of counterattacks which eventually retook Osgiliath and Ithilien. Unfortunately, Boromir is described as receiving a Morgul wound during the war, inflicted by who or what we don't know. Now, we're not sure if Boromir received the same type of Morgul wound as Frodo. It is possible, but that would suggest Gondor had some seriously talented healers at the time, or that Boromir himself was exceedingly strong, because, like Frodo, Boromir did survive the wound. However, it had severe long-term consequences. The wound left him weak and shrunken with pain, and he died only 14 years after receiving it, having only been steward for 12 years. He was 79 when he died, which sounds old, but keep in mind, the Dunedain during this time still had reasonably longer lifespans. His father lived to 102, his son to 118, and his grandson to 125. At the very least, Boromir should have lived another 20 years. Frodo actually ended up suffering similar long-term effects. While outside Minas Morgul, even being near the Witch King is enough for Frodo to feel pain in his shoulder where he was wounded. Later that year, on the 6th of October in 3019, the year anniversary of being stabbed, Frodo feels the pain return, and the following year he ends up getting sick on that same day again. Interestingly, Frodo experiences similar problems with the wound given to him by Shelob. These two problems, along with a host of other things, is why Frodo ends up leaving Middle-earth, because some wounds simply can't be cured in Middle-earth, and perhaps if he stayed, he might have suffered a similar fate to Steward Boromir and died an early death. Alright, so we've established Morgul wounds are really bad. Their purpose is either to turn you into a wraith or perhaps swiftly kill you, even if the wound itself is not immediately fatal. They are meant to be extremely difficult to treat, where people like Aragorn and Glorfindel say they can't, and even Elrond, one of the greatest lore masters ever, takes 3 days to do it. And finally, even if you do survive the Morgul wound, there's a good chance that you're saddled with long-term ailments such as pain, sickness, and possibly even an early death. So considering how potent Morgul weapons are, why aren't they mass-produced? If every orc carries a Morgul weapon, almost every wound they inflict will ultimately be fatal or result in the injured turning into a wraith. Why doesn't the Witch King, while invisible, just run around stabbing everyone with a Morgul knife? I've seen that question get asked multiple times, and to be fair, it's not that stupid a question. It does just seem so overpowered that it would be foolish not to take advantage of. However, while Tolkien never explicitly answered this question, there are some hints and pretty good reasons as to why it isn't the case. Firstly, from what we know, mass-producing magical artifacts doesn't seem so simple. Creating something powerful requires sacrifice of personal power, and oftentimes that cannot be reproduced. Yavanna could not simply regrow the two trees after they were destroyed, Feanor could not craft more Silmarils, Sauron and the elves could not just produce thousands of rings of power. While Morgul weapons aren't on the same scale as those artifacts, they are still magical. Glorfindel notes that the hilt of the Morgul knife that wounded Frodo is covered in dark runes, which possibly empowered the thing. And magical weapons can't just be crafted or wielded by any random pleb, and they might also require some sacrifice of personal power that most creatures, such as regular orcs, aren't capable of. The other reason is that Morgul weapons also seem to have significant weaknesses. In regards to the Morgul knife that wounds Frodo, the point of it breaks off, and a weapon which is primarily used to stab people quickly becomes useless if the stabbing part breaks off whenever it touches someone. On top of that, when the dawning light of the sun lands on the blade of the Morgul knife, it disintegrated. Like I said earlier, we don't know if all Morgul weapons are the same, but if they're anything like the Witch King's Morgul knife, then they aren't exactly durable, nor useful beyond perhaps stabbing a single person. An army of orcs whose weapons disintegrate the moment the sun rises aren't going to be an effective fighting force. So it makes sense that Morgul weapons are only wielded by Sauron's most powerful servants, such as the Nazgul, and that they're only used in circumstances of great importance, against persons of interest such as Frodo or powerful foes such as Steward Boromir. Unfortunately, we don't know just how often the weapons were used, how many people succumbed to the wounds, and just how rare cases of survival such as Frodo and Boromir were, but I think we can safely say that getting wounded by a Morgul weapon was less than ideal. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you've come away from this video thinking that Boromir is just a cursed name, because 2 Boromirs died young, then I can tell you that there's actually a 3rd Boromir who lived a full prosperous life. That was Boromir of the First Age, the first Lord of Ladros, who lived to the grand old age of 94. However, if your name is Denethor, you probably shouldn't name your kid Boromir. Actually, this gives me a video idea. Cheers, farewell, and remember, I think our equivalent of a Morgul wound is basically just rabies.